Apologies in advance if the energy is a bit low today. Some of my friends thought it was a good idea to act like we were in college again. So I woke up at 2:30 today with quite the hangover. Let's draw something. Yeah, I had a rough one last night, but it was all in good fun. That's me walking home at almost 8 in the morning. It's not every day when you come home from drinking that you have to worry about getting a sunburn. In today's video, we're talking about the basics of shading, or you could say the basics of lighting. If you want your drawings to appear three-dimensional, well, you're definitely going to need to know this. We're going to talk about directional light, ambient light, just the basics. There's definitely more to talk about when it comes to shading than what we're just going to cover today, but maybe later I'll do like an advanced tutorial. Grab your pencils, grab your erasers, grab your tank tops. It's pretty hot. 6-pack. Was there anything else I needed to talk about? If you follow me on Instagram, GB_brush, you will have noticed I got another picture on the wall, and it fit nicely on that little tiny wall, that little slim wall I have. It's the only wall I had left essentially in my whole room. The landlord wasn't happy when she saw how many pictures I had hung in the room. She was a very angry Korean woman yelling at me, and I just say, big smile, sorry, I don't understand. Enough talking, let's change perspective. I got something in my eye. What is in my eye? Let's change perspectives. What do I got here? I have a normal pencil, an eraser. I finally got a clear ruler, and then I have the optional eraser guard and fine-tune eraser. I find these very helpful, but you don't necessarily need them. Let's get started. If you missed my last couple videos, well, the first one is the introduction to the basics of drawing, and I talk about drawing shapes like I have here already pre-drawn. And then I also, my second video, talked about perspective drawing and using vanishing points. And you can see here that I used some vanishing points and a horizon to just kind of help me figure out how to draw these two shapes. No matter what your perspective is, a sphere is always going to be the same. It's the shading that's going to change. Of course, I also left some room over here because I'm going to be doing a drawing demo that'll also incorporate some shading. What's the most important thing you need to think about when shading? Well, you need to think about the light source. Let's say my light source is the sun, and it's going to be coming down from up above. So all of them are going to be receiving primary lighting coming in this direction. So primary light is coming in this direction. I'm just going to sketch some of these shapes a little bit nicer while I talk. Ambient light is the light that is bouncing around your environment. So say maybe you had one light coming this direction from like a lamp or something. Well, the fact is this light is going to hit these objects. It's going to bounce around the room. So even though most of the light is coming this way, you still might have a slight subtle light coming in very soft from the other side of the room. Maybe there's a wall right here, so some light is bouncing off the wall. Now also, of course, these shapes are going to be on the ground. And because they're on the ground, that's also a great plane for light to bounce off of. So even though we have light coming this direction, we're eventually going to have to factor in the ambient light. In most situations, you're going to find that different planes catch a little bit different light. And if you're trying to just show your images or stuff to be three-dimensional, then you're going to want to differentiate different planes of different objects. Let's use this ruler to show that the light is coming this direction. I'm going to draw these lines pretty light because we don't necessarily need them. Light coming from the sun essentially always comes in parallel, because you could say the light source itself is bigger than the Earth, so the beam of light is wider than the Earth. So you don't need to worry about the light kind of coning out. That's the word I was looking for, coning. So let's just draw some guidelines on where the light's coming from. And this is mostly going to be helpful for me when I'm drawing my shadows. Let's say the widest part of this object is actually going to be the middle. So I'm going to draw a guideline right there. So now that we know that the light is coming this way, we know that the light is going to hit this plane the hardest. So we'll leave this one mostly white. I'll just darken it up just slightly. Ever so slightly. And when you're shading, you're going to want to use very soft gestures, and you're also going to want to use the side of your pencil, whether it's mechanical or traditional, I think you'd call this. So there we go. The top side of the shape is getting the most light, the most direct light at least, and so it's going to be the lightest. So what does that mean? That means I need to make these two sides darker. If this shading ever takes too long, I'll just jump into a time lapse. Oh, another thing that you might want to consider when you're shading is notice how when I drew these shapes, I kept the outlines of the shapes really light. And that is because if you want to take your shading to be more realistic, if you want to draw more realistically, maybe you've noticed that, objects and things and people, they do not actually have lines. They are actually just, the line is like a mental construction to help you just kind of wrap your mind about what you're looking at. But really, you're not seeing lines. You're seeing the different planes and how the different planes catch light. So in an ideal drawing, this plane and this plane, the only visible line difference what you would see would be this color, this value change. So the line itself should be no darker than this side of the box. So if you can manage to make your value changes very clean without seeing the lines, it will begin to look much more realistic. I mean, you could have a very Illustrator style or a very graphic kind of style that shows the lines, and that'll come off as more of an artistic choice. But if you want your drawings to look more realistic, of course, or painterly or something like that, then you'd want to try to not have your lines be visible. Now we have essentially this box kind of roughly shaded in. Now if I wanted it to also look more realistic, one, I would want to minimize the lines being visible by maybe erasing slightly the edge on this outside here. But also I'd probably take some kind of smoothing tool. I'll drop a picture of a couple smoothing options. You could even just use Q-tips. You could smooth out these things and make it look more plain, or much more uniform as opposed to sketchy, and then of course that'll make it look more realistic. But the next thing we need to do here is draw a shadow. The shadow is going to only stick out about as far as the line comes down from the sun. Now you do want to draw your shadow in perspective along with these lines, so I'm drawing it again as if there's a vanishing point over there to come from, and that'll just keep things looking more precise in perspective. All right, that should be about, I might want this line to be a little bit taller. So this line is essentially mirroring this line here, and then this line here is going to be the ridge of this top fine line meeting this line. A little bit tricky to figure out how to do cubes how to do cube shadows in perspective, but you can figure it out maybe in a more advanced tutorial or by just practice and wrapping your head around. You just got to try to think about where the light's coming from. Like I said, drawing these guide marks from where the light source is coming from can help you wrap your mind out around that. Now, when I'm doing this shadow, I want the shadow to be, what you have to decide is this box going to be darker than the shadow, or is the shadow going to be darker? Most of the time, you're going to want the shadow to be darker than the box. So I'm going to come in pretty heavy here. And another thing you could do is you could kind of have the shadow be as dark as the box, and then you'd kind of have the edge of the box kind of disappear into the shadow, which can be an artistic choice to make your drawing look more interesting, because then the viewer has to kind of figure it out more themselves as opposed to know exactly what's going on. That's kind of like a artistic tool you can use, an advanced artistic tool to draw more interest from the viewer. But what I'm going to do here is, remember, we have to consider ambient light. So the light that's right here at the edge of the box is actually going to be the darkest because it is the most obscured from the primary light source. But as we get further away from the box, we are now finding more opportunities for the ambient light to come in, which is going to make the shadow get slightly less strong as we expand out away from the object. Now right here, the shadow is still pretty close to the object, and it is still in the path from the primary light source, so it is still going to be pretty dark. And you're going to try to want to keep this transition from this side to this side pretty similar in tone, because you want it to look like the same shadow at least. But just consider having maybe a slight gradual gradation where it gets slightly lighter towards the edge of the or towards the end of the shadow. And maybe I'll get rid of some of this line up here. This is why these very precise erasers can be helpful, so that you don't accidentally erase a little bit too much. Be careful when you're wiping the eraser bits off the page though, because you could end up smearing. When you're doing a lot of heavy shading, you get a lot of graphite on the page and then you end up smearing it. The cube wraps up most of the key concepts about shading objects. However, a lot of organic objects are going to be more spherical or cylindrical than, you know, perfect 90-degree angles like on a box. And so when we have something like a sphere, the same principles apply. However, you need to consider the form of the object when you are shading, because if you are shading not considering the form, all of a sudden you're going to make it not look like a sphere anymore. It'll look more like some kind of weird object than perhaps what you're going for. So what you can do is you can maybe make a very faint guide along the center line of the sphere, just so you know you have a generalized path about where the shadow is going to form. You know that the light is hitting mostly up here, but then around here the light is still hitting. It's only once it gets past the center of the sphere that the object actually comes into shadow. Now it's going to be in a darker shadow further towards the bottom, but then we'll get there, but eventually we're going to have to deal with bounce light or bouncing ambient light. So let's do very, very faint up here at the very top, because that's where the sun or the light source is hitting the hardest. Then around the sides of the top half, we are still in the sunlight, but we can start to darken it up just a little bit. I'm actually going to curve this around a little bit higher. So let's darken this up just slightly more, but we are still in the light, so we're going to be very subtle about it. I'm going to drop this a little bit lower. All right. Now you could always go darker. It is a little bit harder to go lighter, so I'm going to just lightly erase the top again. And again, depending on what your background is, if your background is the same, is like another white wall, then the very top line of this sphere is going to almost disappear because it has nothing to contrast to, and there's actually no real lines, like I said, in nature. So I'm going to very carefully almost erase that top line there. So here again, we're slightly coming around the sides of the sphere. Now we need to tackle the other half or hemisphere of this sphere, and this is the hemisphere that's actually in shadow. So I'm going to come in with not a super dark shadow yet, but I'm just going to establish where this line is. The line between where the light is actually hitting the sphere and where the light disappears around the sphere. So this is going to be like a, you could say highlight, light, and this is going to be like your mid-range shadow right here. Now, the tricky part is when you consider bounce light or ambient light that's bouncing around the room. What you need to understand is there's going to be a little bit of bounce light hitting the sides from, coming from the ground, as well as some bounce light might be coming from objects or walls around the sphere. It means that you do need to make this under part the darkest part, but when you consider the bounce light in, you want the darkest part not to be right at the ground, and you don't want the darkest part to be on the edge. You want there to be kind of like this shadow that starts to form and then gets washed out by the bouncing light. So I'm actually going to have the darkest part be about here. And then it's going to gradually go back up to the medium light. All right. So again, we have highlight, light, lit area, medium shadow, a slight rim of the darkest shadow, and then back to the medium shadow because that's where some of the ambient light is bouncing back in. All right. And if you doubt this in theory, go look at some objects, place some cylindrical objects on your table and you'll see what I'm talking about. It looks kind of odd to have an object with bounce light with no shadow. So that's the next part. And making a shadow for a sphere, well, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to compress a circle into an ellipse. If the lighting moved down, then my guidelines would be showing that the shadow would be longer. So again, that's another helpful thing to consider when you have these guidelines about where the lighting's coming from. So let's kind of make this rough ellipse and keep it within the light or within the lines of these guide marks. And like with the cube, let's make the shadow darker directly under it, and then slowly get a little bit lighter as it comes out to the edge of the edge of the shadow, where more ambient light can get inside. The ambient light that's bouncing to the bottom of the sphere becomes much more noticeable once you add a shadow, right? Sometimes you're drawing objects that are a cube, and sometimes you're drawing objects that are spherical. But a lot of times, especially when you're drawing, figures like people and stuff like that, you're going to be coming across situations where you need to light cylinders, or you need to do shading on cylinder type things like my arm. So the same thing applies here. These sides are flat, just like a square, and this side is curved, just like the side of a sphere. So the bounce light you're going to render very similar for this side of the cylinder, very similar to the bounce light of a sphere. And then these sides are very angular and clear, so you're going to shade them similar to how you would shade a cube. Here we have essentially the basics of shading, all right? And these are the most three, I would say, useful objects to consider when you're thinking about shading anything, whether it be organic shapes, spherical shapes, or like these, you know, kind of man-made architecture shapes. I'm going to move over here and jump into a time lapse as I just use this video as an opportunity to make another illustration and practice my own shading. Haha, okay, well, sorry about that. I don't know exactly when yet, but at some point my camera died. So, voila. If you're wondering how I pulled off drawing this staircase in perspective, go back and watch the video here where I talk about how to use perspective drawing and how to use vanishing points. Now, talking about this illustration, some moments that I figured I should highlight. One, I changed the lighting source for this illustration, so the lighting is different from here than over here. Obviously, you could tell by the shadows, and I did that just because I thought the composition would be better if the shadow was over here. Maybe I should have made the blood coming from the shoe kind of like pool out over here. That way it'd kind of bring the whole thing together. Who knows? I'll do another video in the future all about composition, and we could tackle that topic together. Oh, bumped the camera. Places like the top of this wheel, it's catching a little bit of light coming in here. So I found, even though this top of the wheel is in some shade, I figured some light might be bouncing around in there. The top of this kind of like mid-axle here, I should probably put this in a little bit more shade because it is not catching direct sunlight, so it shouldn't be as bright as that. If you look over here at the front of this shoe, this stopper is not exactly on the ground, so I didn't make the shadow quite as dark underneath it because there's a little bit of room for bounce ambient light to come in. There's plenty of details and things happening underneath the shoe, but if an object is far away and it's all in shadow, you don't need to spend forever worrying too much about the details because of course the viewer can put two and two together about what's going on sometimes in the shadows, and you don't need to think about it necessarily too much. Let the viewer kind of figure it out for themselves. It actually makes the drawing a little bit more interesting. Oh, one more note about the sphere that I forgot to mention. You're going to catch more bounce light or ambient light. I can't decide which term I want to use, but you'll catch more ambient reflecting light off of the ground, obviously on this side and on this side, than, for example, right where the actual sphere is touching the ground. So right where the sphere is touching the ground, you can make it a little bit more dark. All right, and then that'll actually make it even more realistic than it was even before. As always, drop in the comments what you guys want me to work on and or talk about in the next video. Be sure to like and subscribe because this is a young channel and it definitely helps me out. Also, even dropping comments helps the algorithm. So, if you liked it, if you want to help me out, that's how to do it. You don't have to send me money or anything like that. Adios.